This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream and Nebula. Sign up at the link in the description to watch the extended, ad-free version of this video, as well as the brand new Night of the Coconut bonus features. The 1980s. One simple question: what is the most 80s movie ever made?
Say, take my breath away.
Yes, good. Oh man, very nice, very nice. Looking at your resume here, you don't seem to have much experience in the theater. Until recently, you were working at the Department of Interdimensional Crime?
Yes, but I am really trying to make a career shift.
This is so funny! Oh my god, we were just talking about bringing in someone like you. Sharon, you remember we were talking about this? Okay, see, we have this, I guess you would call it a beastly spider living in the basement. This thing is huge. It's like the big Harry Potter spider. Like it might as well be an alien from another dimension. That's what you dealt with when you were a space cop, right? Big aliens? Well, maybe you would be more interested in helping us with big aliens than GoBots the musical, because this ain't getting out of previews.
How dare you show your face here, you life-stealing monster? You make me sick. I ought to beat you with a rolling pin.
You think you can just... Would you stop talking over me?
Patrick, that's a mirror.
Oh, right. Thought it was the other me. Thanks, Chloe. Wait, Chloe? What are you doing here?
Matt said I could stay here while he was filming in Italy. What are you doing here?
Matt said I could stay here while he was filming in Italy.
Oh, God, Matt. So I guess that means...
I have a roommate.
I'm opening all of Matt's wine.
This is so much better than my homemade wine on the island. The secret ingredient was seawater. I almost died drinking that wine.
So why are you crashing here? I assumed your alternate self would have left behind a fortune when he ran off.
Nope, just mountains of debt. And several boxes of unopened Funko Pops, but I threw those in the Gowanus Canal. What about you?
I figured I'd make a fresh start here. You know, put aside hunting criminal robots and go back to my old dream of making a career in musical theater. Turns out that's kind of hard.
And so you asked Matt for help because you two are...
Friends. We're just friends. I am going to slingshot you through the space-time continuum if you continue giving me that look.
I'm sorry. I'll drop it. Look, the point is, we're both in the same spot right now. Back at the bottom.
More wine?
Okay, so here are my guesses for what happened in all the Marvel movies I missed over the past 2 years.
And this is the live feed of the Oops All Jake universe.
Oh, they're sleeping like little angels.
Would I write and star in a My Little Pony musical? 100%. You know what? I actually feel bad for people who aren't in our situation. Like, yes, we are at rock bottom, but that's where the hope is. First, when there's nothing but the slow, glowing dream that your fear seems to hide deep inside your mind. It's very motivating.
Yeah, you know, Chloe, you're like Jennifer Beals in Flashdance, a blue-collar heroine with dreams of stardom.
Wait, is that the girl who dumps water all over herself?
Actually, you and me, We're like the main characters in an 80s movie. An underdog with big dreams, trying to become the best at like karate or bartending, pushing it to the limit, walking along the razor's edge, being the best around and never letting anything bring them down.
So what are you getting at?
Well, maybe. If we study 80s movies as like a blueprint, we'll have a roadmap to success. Because in those movies, they always succeed in the end.
What about Scarface?
They always succeed in the end. But Chloe, first, we need to answer the most important question of all. What is the most 80s movie ever made?
Patrick, we've had too much wine. Just stick to Marvel movies.
No, Chloe. Chloe, this is the video now. The 1980s. There is probably no other decade that conjures quite as clear a mental image. Ronald Reagan is president, the Cold War is going strong, Michael Jackson and Madonna are tearing up the charts, and Hulkamania is running wild, while everyone in America is wearing acid-wash jeans and jackets with huge shoulder pads. And while film scholars will usually tell you the 80s were a low point for American cinema, this was the decade that produced the films that shaped an entire generation. From Back to the Future, to Ghostbusters, to Dirty Dancing, to Revenge of the Nerds 2, Nerds in Paradise. And so, there's a question that has been nagging at me for the last couple of years, really. Of all the 80s movies, which one is the most 80s movie? I don't mean what is the best 80s movie or the most popular 80s movie, but what is the movie that most encapsulates everything about the decade? I'm talking the aesthetics, the politics, the cultural trends, developments in the film industry, the music. I'm talking about a movie that could not exist in any other decade. Something you could hand to someone who's never seen a movie and say, this is the 1980s embodied in one film. And to figure this out, we're going to use what we all know is the best possible method of analyzing art: numbers and math. See, I've created a series of categories to evaluate the films, grading them on a numerical scale by how well they represent aspects of the decade. And once we compare their final scores, we will finally be able to answer the question that has plagued scholars for centuries. What is the most 80s movie ever made? Right now, you're probably thinking, Patrick, well over 1,000 films were given wide theatrical releases between 1980 and 1989. How the fuck are you gonna cover them all in one video? Well, that is a good and reasonable question. I will admit, this is a lot to tackle, so here's what I did. First, I cataloged every movie that received a wide theatrical release in North America between 1980 and 1989 into a spreadsheet. And then, no, I did not watch every one of those movies because that's impossible and I don't have 5 years to work on this video, but I watched a bunch of them, and then I watched the trailers to all the rest to get an idea of what they all were, and then did a lot more research on top of that. And what was clear was that most of these movies could just be eliminated automatically. See, many movies that people think of as iconic 80s movies aren't really all that specific to the era. And the whole point of this is to find movies that would only exist in the 80s. So anything by Steven Spielberg is pretty much timeless. There's nothing 80s about Indiana Jones. And even E.T., despite helping create the kids on bikes in the suburbs trope associated with the 80s, could pretty much be made in any decade. A lot of action movies or romantic comedies seem 80s in style, but if you swap out the clothes and music, they're not too different from similar movies that are still made to this day. So I'm sorry, but Lethal Weapon, When Harry Met Sally, Dirty Dancing, they aren't actually all that 80s. What, no Predator? Sorry, no Predator. These are all still good movies, though. Now, there are some that came closer to making the cut, like Working Girl or Rambo First Blood Part 2, but they still didn't quite make it. People always bring up John Hughes movies as being pure artifacts of the 80s, and yes, the teen movies he was making were new at the time, but their influence carried over into the following decades, and we're still getting Hughes-esque movies to this day. Look, from Romeo and Juliet to Romeo plus Juliet, teen angst is a theme as old as time, and it works in any era. Same goes for the rest of the countless teen comedies released in the 80s. Even Weird Science, as 80s as it is, wasn't quite 80s enough to make the cut. The Goonies, nope. They still made tons of similar kids' adventure movies in the 90s. Beverly Hills Cop, the music is very 80s, but other than that, Eddie Murphy could have made that same thing 20 years later. Desperately Seeking Susan, the clothes are as 80s as it gets, but the rest of the movie, not so much. You gotta have enough points in different categories. A lot of you are probably asking about Back to the Future, and look, most of that movie takes place in the 50s, and that Alan Silvestri score doesn't have nearly enough synthesizers on it. Sorry. Of the many 80s comedies starring Saturday Night Live alumni, Ghostbusters comes the closest to making the cut, with its focus on succeeding in business, the theme song, and government regulation portrayed as the bad guy, but despite those elements, it's still a comedy about lovable underdogs made with a classical filmmaking style and a classical orchestral score, and those kept getting made for decades after. It's pretty timeless. And I apologize to a lot of you out there, but Roadhouse did not make the cut. Maybe if it had more synthesizer music or a Russian bad guy, but as it is, it's not enough. So anyway, I went through this list over several days, whittling it down and down and down and down, and finally arrived at our short list. The final list of 10 contenders that will be battling it out for the title. And in alphabetical order, they are. First, we have Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo, the 1984 dance movie that was released only 7 months after the original Breakin', with a sequel subtitle so ridiculous that it's still used as a punchline today.
Charlie McDennis 2, Electric Boogaloo.
Directed by Sam Furstenberg, the auteur behind Ninja 3: The Domination, this was a production of Cannon Films, or the Cannon Group, which no discussion of 80s cinema is complete without. Cannon, of course, was the new film studio run by Israeli cousins Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus that started with cheap B-movies and, during the 80s, became a major competitor to the other Hollywood studios before eventually collapsing at the end of the decade. Anyway, Breakin' 2 is about a group of dancers who need to put on a show to save the local community center from wealthy real estate developers. It is extremely 80s. Then we've got Flashdance from 1983, the original Don Simpson, Jerry Bruckheimer high-concept production that became one of the most influential movies of the decade. Starring Jennifer Beals as a steel worker who dances at a sleazy bar but really dreams of attending a prestigious dance academy, this was director Adrian Lyne's breakthrough film before he made Fatal Attraction and Jacob's Ladder. It's essentially 90 minutes of montages and dance sequences set to one of the biggest soundtracks of the decade. It is very 80s. Now, it was hard to choose among all of the movies that Chuck Norris made in the 80s. He made a lot. But I finally settled on Invasion USA from 1985, in which Norris must defend America from an invasion by Soviet and Cuban terrorists. It's a similar premise to John Milius's Red Dawn, but because this is a Chuck Norris starring Cannon Films production, it just had more of that 80s sleaze that gave it the edge. In this movie, terrorists attack a shopping mall at Christmas, and Norris, wearing all denim, kills them all. This was definitely made in the 80s. Next up, Albert Magnoli's seminal 1984 film, Purple Rain, which is basically Prince the movie. It stars Prince as a loosely fictionalized version of himself, telling a loosely fictionalized version of his real-life origin story as a young musician trying to make a name for himself in the Minneapolis music scene. The movie is wall-to-wall Prince music, whether he's performing it on stage, or it's playing over montages of Prince driving his purple motorcycle. There is absolutely no decade but the 80s when this movie could have been made. After spending all of this time studying 80s movies, I have come to the conclusion that the ultimate 80s auteur and the ultimate 80s movie star, it has to be none other than Sylvester Stallone. In that decade, Stallone wasn't just the highest paid movie star in Hollywood, with 2 massive franchises to his name. During that decade, he also wrote 9 movies and directed 3. He is so important to that decade of American cinema that he is going to be represented twice on this list. And first up, it's Rocky IV. In this installment, Rocky Balboa, who's now basically just the Michael Jordan of boxing, must represent the US and take on the evil, emotionless Soviet boxer Ivan Drago, played by Dolph Lundgren, and basically win the Cold War by boxing. It's also the movie where Paulie gets a robot butler. It's a very 80s movie. Almost all the movies on this list are 90 minutes long. Our next contender, Brian De Palma's Scarface from 1983, is twice that length. I would argue this is the best movie on this list, but does that make it the most 80s movie? We'll see. Until maybe The Wolf of Wall Street, this was the greatest cinematic study of greed, excess, and opulence, which were defining characteristics of that decade, as we'll get into later. It stars Al Pacino, giving one of the biggest performances in film history as Cuban immigrant Tony Montana, who takes over Miami's organized crime world. Along the way, there are a lot of pastel-colored suits, a lot of neon lights, a lot of Giorgio Moroder music, and a hell of a lot of cocaine. It is pure, uncut 80s. Far away from Scarface, but not quite as far as you might think, is Herbert Ross's 1987 comedy, The Secret of My Success. It stars Michael J. Fox, in between Back to the Future installments, as a farm boy from the Midwest who moves to New York City with dreams of becoming a rich businessman. That's it. There's no specific field he wants to work in, no industry or career he's passionate about. He just wants to work in an office and make a lot of money. And spoilers, he does. By having an affair with his aunt. It's a very 80s movie. Okay, I promised more Stallone, and here it is. Probably his strangest project of the decade, other than maybe the pizza scene in Cobra. The next movie on our list is 1983's Staying Alive, the sequel to Saturday Night Fever that ignores all the darker, troubling material of the original, like the sexual assault and suicide. Here, John Travolta returns as Tony Manero, now living in Manhattan and trying to make it as a Broadway dancer. Stallone directed and co-wrote this movie, and it feels less like the original Saturday Night Fever and more like a Rocky sequel about dancing. It once again features songs by the Bee Gees, but it also features an equal number of songs by, you guessed it, Frank Stallone. Saturday Night Fever is a quintessential 70s movie, and Staying Alive is just about as 80s as it gets. Okay, next up, we've got the 1986 skateboarding teen drama, Thrashin', directed by David Winters, who, fun fact, played one of the Jets in the original West Side Story. This movie stars a young Josh Brolin, hot off the success of The Goonies, as a California skater hoping to win this big downhill race, but he has to face off against a mean gang called the Daggers. It features endless skateboarding montages, some of the most 80s fashion you will ever see on screen, and an appearance by the Red Hot Chili Peppers 5 years before they got famous. It is extremely 80s. And now, our final contender, one of the biggest blockbusters of the decade. Folks, you probably guessed it, it's Top Gun. In 1986, Simpson and Bruckheimer basically repeated their formula for Flashdance here. Another story of ambition, helmed by a slick British commercial director, this time Tony Scott, full of montages set to huge pop hits, but this time, instead of being about dancing, it was about fighter pilots in the Navy, so you got that American militarism that was so big in the 80s. It turned Tom Cruise into the confident face of American excellence, it made Val Kilmer a star, and it taught us all that movies are way cooler when every scene takes place at sunset. Top Gun is a very 80s movie. So here's how this is going to work. We are going to go through 5 distinct chapters and attempt to summarize the major developments that happened during the decade of the 1980s and how they impacted American cinema. We'll start with aesthetics and cinematic trends, then developments in the film industry, then music, then politics, and finally, American culture. So basically, I am going to try to explain the entire decade in this one video. And obviously, I'm the perfect guy for the job because I was alive for about 2 years of the 80s, during which I looked like this. And at the end of each of these chapters, we will go through a series of categories and score each movie on a numerical system depending on how well they represent that particular aspect of 80s cinema. Do they feature the Cold War? How ambitious are the protagonists? How many montages are there, and are they set to Kenny Loggins songs? And by the end, based on this totally scientific numerical scale using a total of 32 different categories, we will have a winner. So come on, it's time to ride into the danger zone, because the heat is on, and nothing's gonna stop us now. In the June 1981 issue of Time magazine, MGM's Reed Rosenfeld was quoted as saying, "We're no longer in the movie business. We're in the entertainment software business." If you want a simple representation of how American movie aesthetics changed from the 70s to the 80s, you only really need to look at the work of one filmmaker. I'm talking about everybody's favorite Facebook grandpa, Paul Schrader. In 1980, he shifted away from the dark, gritty, working-class, naturalistic aesthetics of movies like Blue Collar or Taxi Driver and defined what we would now consider the 80s style. In American Gigolo, it's all right there from minute one. It's bright, clean, and polished. Schrader has ditched grimy New York streets for the Southern California coastline. Pastel colors abound, the clothes are the height of then-current fashion, and in the opening credits, written in cursive text, are the words, "Music by Giorgio Moroder, the king of synthesizer music." The prevailing word to describe this is slick. The common aesthetic that defined the decade had 3 main components. There was the frequent use of non-diegetic pop songs, usually in montages, the deliberately glossy, attention-grabbing camera work, lighting, and production design, and fast, rapid editing. These elements were commonly labeled MTV aesthetics, but that's not entirely accurate. See, MTV didn't expand beyond a few select markets until 1983, the same year that Flashdance, the ultimate MTV aesthetics movie, was released, so the trend had already been developing. The bigger aesthetic influence were music videos themselves, which long predated MTV. The pop music-filled soundtracks were largely a result of Saturday Night Fever's massive success, and we'll talk a lot more about that in the chapter on music. By the mid-80s, Dolby stereo sound had become standard on most movies, so the improved sound technology led to a greater use of songs on the soundtracks. The desire to fit more songs into the movies led to more montages, kind of the perfect place to put a song, which caught on as a convenient storytelling device for compressing time. As far as editing rhythms go, ever since the beginning of cinema, film editing has steadily grown faster over time. But in the 80s, this steady evolution sped up thanks to a few developments. One was the technological advancements in nonlinear and digital editing systems, but the larger one was the rise of cable TV and VCRs, which trained viewers to process rapid images on screen, whether flipping through channels or hitting the rewind and fast forward buttons on the remote. The larger change in cinematic visuals can be attributed to a new wave of feature film directors who had spent years making TV commercials in the UK, specializing in making slick, glossy, stylized images designed to sell products. These filmmakers included the likes of brothers Ridley and Tony Scott, Adrian Lyne, Alan Parker, and even Michael Mann, an American who studied and began working in the UK. In his book, The New Hollywood, 1981 to 1999, Paul Ramacher describes the visual changes in 80s American movies as such. Documentary and art cinema influences were set aside, directors and cinematographers instead turning to amplified revisions of classical era precedents. Saturated color displaced desaturated, sharp, clean images displaced the tendency to graininess or diffusion in 70s cinema, Steadicam largely replaced handheld camera work, and high contrast lighting replaced the low contrast natural look. Beyond just the visual aesthetics, a set of narrative tropes emerged that became extremely popular in 80s cinema. There was what writer Susan Jeffords coined the Hollywood hard body, the idealized, muscle-bound, hypermasculine look of cinematic heroes in this era, best represented by Arnold Schwarzenegger or Sylvester Stallone. There was the biracial buddy cop duo, like in 48 Hours, Lethal Weapon, or Running Scared. The Reaganite female character, a term coined by writer Douglas Kellner, which refers to a competitive, career-minded woman who retains her femininity, like Kelly McGillis's character in Top Gun. As for the fashion, come on, you don't need me to explain what 80s fashion was. Desperately Seeking Susan, St. Elmo's Fire, Wall Street, that's 80s fashion. We'll cover a lot more in the following chapters, so for now, let's move on to our first round of categories, shall we? Okay, our categories are: how many montages? 1 point for each. How glossy are the visuals on a scale of 1 to 5 points? Is there an influence of music videos? 1 to 5 points. How 80s is the fashion? 1 to 5 points. And for 2 points each, does it feature a Hollywood hard body? Is there a biracial buddy cop duo? Is there a Reaganite female? And bonus round, does it end on a freeze frame? First up, Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo. A fairly strong showing for this one in the first round, since the movie is pretty much just a series of dance montages featuring the most 80s fashion you've ever seen, and they all look like music videos. But the cinematography doesn't have the gloss, that stylized high contrast lighting that you'll see in other movies of the time, so it loses some points there. Hey, maybe this was just the result of the rushed production time. We'll never know what cinematic heights Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo could have reached if it had been given the time it needed. Okay, time for Flashdance, which gets off to an amazing start in the first round. Another dance montage-filled movie, this scores similarly to Breakin' 2, but it beats it in terms of glossy visuals. Practically every scene in this movie has this strong, perfect backlighting, plus tons of dramatic smoke and fog. The fashion is not quite as 80s, although this might be the ultimate leg-warmer movie. And of course, bonus points, we've got that freeze frame at the end. Next, Invasion USA, and aesthetically, this movie isn't really very interesting. There's no montages, no music video influence, and the fashion isn't really noteworthy other than Chuck Norris's all denim plus mullet look. Norris is a quintessential 80s Hollywood hardbody though, so it earns points there. Okay, now on to Purple Rain, another music-driven movie, so it scores similarly to Breakin' and Flashdance. This is definitely one of the most music video-like movies ever made, considering that the artist himself is the star and performs almost the entire soundtrack. And it has that incredible freeze frame at the end. Rocky IV. Stallone has never been a particularly visually stylish director, but he is one of the kings of the montage. It obviously gets points for the Hollywood hardbody. I mean, this thing is wall-to-wall hardbodies. Rocky, Apollo, Drago, Robot Butler. And even though this is not a cop movie, I'll give it 1 point for the biracial buddy cop duo, because Rocky and Apollo are basically that. And bonus points, freeze frame. Now, Scarface is an interesting case because De Palma was really doing his regular thing here and ignoring a lot of current cinematic trends. So the aesthetic isn't the glossy music video type thing that was in style, but the movie is still pretty slick, so it gets some points. There's some very 80s fashion with a ton of pastel colors, and even though it only has one montage, the legendary Push It to the Limit scene, it's one of the best montages in film history. So you know what? I'm just throwing in an extra point, because this is my show and I make the rules. Next up, the secret of my success. We've got several montages here, but not a particularly glossy visual style. It's all set in offices, so the fashion is mostly men in suits, though we do get some women's power suits with serious shoulder pads, so it earns some points there. And finally, in Helen Slater's character, we have a perfect Reaganite female. She's ambitious and career-focused and rapidly rising through the ranks at the office, but she's still presented as the beautiful object of desire for Michael J. Fox's character. And don't worry, freeze frame. Freeze frame! On to Staying Alive. Stallone is back as a director, so that once again means a lot of montages. The visuals are glossier than Rocky's because most of it is about the production of a Broadway musical, which means a ton of dance sequences and a way bigger music video influence. The 80s fashion in the show costumes are incredible, and you'd better believe it, it's got that freeze frame at the end. Our next contender is Thrashin', and this makes a very strong showing. A ton of montages and some 80s fashion that honestly rivals Breakin'. It doesn't earn any points for a lot of the tropes, but seriously, I really can't overstate this. So many montages. And now our final contender, Top Gun. A movie that begins with a montage so iconic that they just completely recreated it in this year's sequel. In the 80s, absolutely no one was doing glossier visuals than Tony Scott. The whole thing looks like a commercial for the Navy. It earns points for a quintessential Reaganite female, and while the Hollywood hardbody generally refers to a specific kind of hypermasculine hero, this still gets a point because, I mean, come on, the volleyball scene. All right, at the end of our first round, Flashdance and Purple Rain have taken the lead, with Staying Alive just 1 point behind. This shouldn't be surprising considering that these are the 3 movies that most resemble music videos. Invasion USA is far behind, but hey, maybe old Chuck Norris can catch up once we get to the politics round. Anyway, let's move on. Time for round 2. The pursuit of making money is the only reason to make movies. We have no obligation to make history. We have no obligation to make art. Our obligation is to make money, and to make money, it may be necessary to make history, art, or some significant statement. We now move on to the larger film industry. In part 1, we were just talking about styles and trends, choices the filmmakers themselves were making. But now, we need to talk about the larger systemic developments. What were the studio bigwigs doing? What business developments affected the movies that got made? Digging back through the history of 80s American cinema, it becomes apparent that nearly all the aspects of current Hollywood that we're always complaining about these days, like studios betting on the same safe choices all the time, focusing on endless franchises as dependable brands, constantly increasing the budgets of blockbusters at the expense of smaller movies, and corporate mergers hurting everything, all of these things began in the 80s. In that decade, as Thomas Schatz describes in his paper Seismic Shifts in the American Film Industry, the major Hollywood studios were kind of in a state of disarray. Several new studios, like Canon, Orion, and TriStar, sprang up and were quickly competing with them, so it was no longer a small handful of studios wielding all the power over what movies got made. At the same time, the major talent agencies were developing and packaging blockbusters, like attaching huge stars to projects and taking control away from the studios. And so in this state, several of the studios ended up either merging or being acquired by larger corporations. United Artists merged with MGM, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp bought 20th Century Fox, and craziest of all, Columbia Pictures was purchased by Coca-Cola. Look, we all complain about like AT&T or more recently Discovery owning Warner Brothers, but a soda company used to own the studio that makes Spider-Man movies. So really, this is nothing new. And of course, we can't forget that much of this became possible thanks to the Reagan administration's deregulation campaign, which relaxed restrictions on media companies, so now movie studios and TV networks could be part of the same corporation. And don't worry, we're gonna talk way more about Reagan when we get to chapter 4, which is on politics. Kicked off by the massive success of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg's movies in the late 70s, which were escapist, exciting movies that played for audiences of all ages, the 80s saw a new breed of blockbuster emerge. Many of these adhered to what Don Simpson, first an executive at Paramount and then a producer partnered with Jerry Bruckheimer, coined the high concept. This was his formula for manufacturing hits. People tend to throw around the phrase high concept to mean like conceptually smart, but a high concept movie, as designed by Simpson, was really one that you could explain in a single sentence. Think Beverly Hills Cop. A wisecracking, streetwise cop from Detroit travels to the luxurious world of Beverly Hills to solve a murder. People knew exactly what it was based on the concept alone. Here's how producer Linda Obst described the high concept formula in a bit more detail. Don created the 3-act structure that we all use. Don made up this logarithm. There is a hot first act with an exciting incident, and the second act with the crisis and the dark bad moments in which our hero is challenged, and the third act with the triumphant moment and the redemption and the freeze frame ending. While Simpson did produce some genuinely good movies, it's clear that he looked at them as products, not art. Again, let's look back at the quote from the beginning of the chapter: "We have no obligation to make art, our obligation is to make money." And that way of thinking became extremely common. In his book, American Cinema of the 1980s, Stephen Prince writes, "The widespread embrace of sequels in the 80s showcased the status of film as pure product merchandising. Sequels were like brand labels, and the studios sought to brand audience loyalty by developing characters and film properties that could be manufactured in perpetuity." In the 80s, the way audiences watched movies changed as well. Home video and cable TV became new markets where movies could make additional profits and reach a new audience. And as shopping malls became a center of American life, they soon became the place that most Americans watched movies, as the number of multiplexes in malls nearly doubled in the 80s. Malls became a major hangout spot for teenagers. And with more multiplexes in malls, more teens were going to the movies, and Hollywood responded with a huge wave of teen movies that outdid anything they'd ever done before. The root of this, actually, was John Travolta. See, he became a huge star playing a teen on the sitcom Welcome Back, Kotter, and then his fame exploded when he played young people in Saturday Night Fever and Grease. These arrived right around the same time as National Lampoon's Animal House, and suddenly, Hollywood was desperate to crank out as many raunchy teen comedies as possible. The success of Animal House led to more National Lampoon movies, National Lampoon being the humor magazine that spun out of the Harvard Lampoon in the 70s, and one of their staff writers, John Hughes, started working on those movies. As his career took off in the 80s, he wrote and directed several of the most influential teen movies in film history, like The Breakfast Club or Ferris Bueller's Day Off. There were actually so many teen movies being made that the studios needed to create variety, so their strategy was to put teen characters in different genres of movies. So you have the countless slasher movies about teens, lots of teen sex comedies, teen dramas, teen sports movies about becoming a werewolf, and so on. Alright, so it's time for the Part 2 categories. Category 1, how high is the concept? 1 to 5 points. Also 1 to 5 points, how much is it aimed at a teen audience? For 2 points, is it a sequel or based on an existing intellectual property? Also 2 points, is it produced or released by one of the new studios from the 80s? And for 1 to 5 points, how 80s is the cast? Breakin' 2 has a very simple premise, but I don't think it quite conforms to the Don Simpson formula, so it gets 3 points there. It's definitely aimed at a teen audience, although there are no scenes actually set at a high school, so I have to dock 1 point. It's a sequel from Canon Films, big points there, and as for the cast, I guess I'll give it 3 points because it didn't actually have any real movie stars in it, but also its main actors pretty much stopped acting by the end of the decade. I'm sorry, Boogaloo Shrimp. We still love you. Okay, and now on to Flashdance. This is the ultimate Don Simpson high concept movie. It has the exciting first act incident, the performance with the original Ice Bucket Challenge. It has the dark second act crisis, Alex and her boyfriend break up and her mentor dies, and then it ends with the triumphant dance audition and a final freeze frame. Plus, it's aimed at teens. It's an original movie from Paramount Pictures, no points there, but it earns points for the cast because, I mean, come on. Jennifer Beals is an 80s icon. Invasion USA. Once again, very simple premise, Soviet and Cuban terrorists invade Florida, but not full high concept formula, since Norris is never really challenged. The second half of the movie is just him wiping out endless bad guys without any setbacks. It's not aimed at a teen audience, although I'm sure teens who saw it enjoyed it. This one also earns points for Canon Films, and the cast? Come on, it's a Chuck Norris movie, full points. Purple Rain is not a Don Simpson production, but it does adhere just about perfectly to the high concept formula. It's not about teenagers, since no one actually knows Prince's age, but it is definitely aimed at a teen to 20-something audience. Basically, people who are Prince fans. This one isn't based on an IP, but also, I hate to say it, but Prince kind of is the IP here, so I'll give it a point. And the cast? Well, they're all mostly musicians and not movie stars, but it's so of its time that I have to give it some points. Next up is Rocky IV, another movie that perfectly fits the high concept formula. Rocky has to take on an unstoppable Soviet boxer who kills his best friend in the ring, and in the end has a spectacular victory. Freeze frame ending. This isn't directly aimed at teens, but part of the Rocky franchise's success was that they were basically family movies. They were rated PG, and so they worked for audiences of all ages. It's not just a sequel, it is the 4th installment in the series, so I'm throwing in an extra point. And the cast? Even though Stallone and Carl Weathers became stars in the 70s, the 80s were really their peak. And this one adds Dolph Lundgren and Brigitte Nielsen, so yeah, this gets some big points there. I think Rocky IV is gonna be a real contender. Okay, this is not a great round for Scarface. It is not really a high-concept movie. The premise is simple, but it's a 3-hour drama where the main character dies at the end. And so, while teens might have enjoyed sneaking into this movie, it was not aimed at them. It's a very loose remake of a movie from 1931, so I'll give it 1 point in the existing IP category. And the cast? I mean, Al Pacino and Michelle Pfeiffer, they've had 40-year careers. They're still going strong. Same with F. Murray Abraham. But you know what? We'll give it a couple points for Robert Loggia and Paul Shenar. A movie that performed much better this round was The Secret of My Success. It's not a perfect high concept. I think the movie is a bit too complicated to be boiled down to a single sentence, but it does fit the 3-act structure nicely. Despite being about working in the corporate world, it's definitely aimed at a teen audience. And the cast? Perfectly 80s. This was the height of Michael J. Fox's movie stardom as America's favorite teen. And then we've got Helen Slater, Supergirl herself, as his love interest, and the supporting cast is all 80s staples like Fred Gwynne, Richard Jordan, and Margaret Whitten, aka the owner of the team in Major League. And now it's on to Staying Alive. It's clear that few understood the high concept formula like Sylvester Stallone did, so this one also gets full points there. He took everything dark and complicated about Saturday Night Fever and pushed it away in favor of a simple story about a guy with big dreams who has some setbacks but finally triumphs in the end. It is less about youth culture than the original film, and Travolta is now distinctly in the adult era of his career, but still, while the first movie was rated R, this is PG, and so aimed at a broader audience. The cast is moderately 80s, I guess? Travolta would remain a star for decades, and most of the rest of the cast didn't really do much else. But hey, it does have an early Kurtwood Smith appearance. That's cool. Next up is Thrashin', another movie that really understands the high concept formula. A talented skater moves to LA and tries to win a big race. He loses his love interest, gets injured, but in the end wins the race and wins his girl back. It's aimed at pretty much no one over the age of 19. It's not a sequel, and it was an independent production, no points there. And as for the cast, this was only Josh Brolin's second movie. And obviously, he's been a major Hollywood actor for decades. The guy is Thanos. And the rest of the cast is actors who are barely known, with the exception of Sherilyn Fenn, who would be cast in Twin Peaks a couple years later. So, you know what, for her, I'll give it a few points. And finally, Top Gun, another perfect high concept movie. Maverick wants to be the best pilot. In the middle of the movie, his best friend dies, and then in the end, he proves he's the best pilot. While it is a movie about adults, like Goose has a kid, the cast is all young, and it's definitely playing to an audience of teens and up. The cast is, in some regards, timeless. Tom Cruise has remained one of the biggest movie stars in the world for decades. But it's also full of iconic 80s character actors like Tom Skerritt, Michael Ironside, and James Tolkan that absolutely place it in the 80s. Okay, now that round 2 is complete, it is still Flashdance and Purple Rain tied for first place. But Rocky IV, the ultimate overblown 80s sequel, had a huge round and is now just 1 point behind them. Sadly, Scarface is lagging all the way back in last place. I guess that's what it gets for trying to be a good movie and not just a soundtrack delivery system. But speaking of soundtracks, it's time for part 3, the music round. 80s music. Come on, you guys know this. Even you Gen Z kids who have never actually watched a movie from the 80s, just think of like the Stranger Things theme song, or Blinding Lights by The Weeknd. That's pretty much what 80s movie scores and soundtracks sounded like. In other words, synthesizers all over the damn place. Now look, obviously this was also the decade when John Williams was cranking out traditional orchestral bangers like E.T. and Indiana Jones, but there were some pretty radical musical shifts happening alongside that. The synthesizer had obviously existed in film scores before, usually in science fiction movies or in the scores composed by Wendy Carlos, like A Clockwork Orange. But it wasn't until 1979, when Giorgio Moroder won an Oscar for his score to Midnight Express, that synth scores were legitimized and suddenly exploded in popularity. The synthesizer-driven 80s sound was largely defined by 3 composers who only really worked in film during this 10-year period. They are the aforementioned Moroder, Harold Faltermeyer, and the German band Tangerine Dream. They made some of the defining film music of this era, from Risky Business to Top Gun to Beverly Hills Cop to Scarface. Music that, when you hear it, you instantly know it only could have been made during one decade. Or I guess it also could have been made like during the past decade, since 80s pastiches and throwback scores have become so trendy, but you get what I'm saying. Before he started working in Hollywood, Moroder was already an extremely successful writer and producer in the world of pop music, mostly for his collaborations with Donna Summer, which revolutionized the sound of disco and electronic pop music. His transition to film music heralded similar moves for other musicians best known for pop music. Toto wrote the score for David Lynch's Dune, Stuart Copeland of The Police did the music for Rumblefish, Eurythmics did music for 1984, and David Byrne did the music for Married to the Mob. But the bigger development in movie music was something that we like to call synergy. In 1977, a man named Robert Stigwood produced a movie called Saturday Night Fever. Stigwood also happens to be the manager of the group, the Bee Gees, and commissioned them to create a collection of songs for the movie that would be packaged together on the soundtrack along with other disco songs featured in the film. This part was nothing new, but what was new was the way that Stigwood promoted it. In an unprecedented move, Stigwood released the soundtrack before the movie actually opened, along with several songs released as singles. So by the time the movie was released in theaters, they had multiple top 10 hits and the #1 album in the country. The popularity of the music built excitement for the movie, which became a huge hit, and once the movie was out, it drove more sales of the soundtrack. Each one promoted the other, and suddenly, the Stigwood approach was born. Hollywood would repeat this countless times during the 80s, with Footloose, Purple Rain, Flashdance, and Top Gun being among the most successful examples. Moroder became extremely involved here, writing and producing hit songs like What a Feeling from Flashdance, Take My Breath Away from Top Gun, and of course, Meet Me Halfway by Kenny Loggins from the Sylvester Stallone arm wrestling classic, Over the Top. In 1983, MTV became an additional branch of this synergistic marketing, since the music videos for these songs, often featuring movie footage, would air on TV, providing additional promotion. 1 month after Flashdance was released in theaters, the music video for Maniac was released to MTV, and the video consisted entirely of movie footage. Like, there is zero footage of the artist performing at all. It's pretty much just a 3-minute movie trailer. This soon entered MTV's daily rotation, airing twice per day on TV, and there, promoting Flashdance and its soundtrack. In fact, Al Teller at Paramount Pictures said that he chose to make Top Gun in part because he saw the aerial sequences as good opportunities to insert songs and repeat the Flashdance formula. And obviously, it worked. So when we look back at the music of 80s movies, what do we see? Or hear? Well, a whole lot of synthesizers and a whole lot of pop music, often cynically crammed into as many scenes as possible as a way to boost album sales. And look, I'm not gonna lie, there were some real bangers released during that time. Okay, now for the part 3 categories. First, for 1 to 5 points, how 80s is the original score? Then, for 2 points, is the score by a composer who mostly or exclusively worked in the 80s? Then, does it feature original songs made for the movie? Given 1 point per song. For 2 points, does it feature a song with the same name as the movie? Also 2 points, did it have an official soundtrack? Then, how many top 10 singles did the soundtrack have? 1 point per song. And finally, the bonus round, for 2 points, does it have a Kenny Loggins song? Breakin' 2 barely has an original musical score, since almost all the music that's there comes from needle drops. But what is there sounds kind of like soap opera music, so yeah, I guess it does sound kind of 80s, but it doesn't make much of an impression. In fact, the composer, Michael Lynn, was much more prolific as a music editor on movies in the 80s and 90s. This movie absolutely had an original soundtrack full of original songs, featuring the lead single, Electric Boogaloo, by Ollie and Jerry. Sadly, no Kenny Loggins though. Okay, and now Flashdance, one of the most musically important movies of the decade, maybe ever. And the first appearance in this round of Giorgio Moroder, maybe the king of the 80s movie soundtrack. The score, all synthesizers, as 80s as it gets. This round, I think Flashdance might be the one to beat. It has an original soundtrack with 9 original songs, and 2 of them went to #1 on the Billboard chart. If it weren't for the lack of Kenny Loggins, this would be the quintessential 80s movie soundtrack. Invasion USA, unsurprisingly, is not a movie known for its music. There is no original soundtrack, no top 10 singles, and definitely no Kenny Loggins song. Interestingly, of all the movies here, this is the only one with a traditional orchestral score that doesn't really sound 80s at all. It's composed by Jay Chataway, who mostly worked on film scores in the 80s, but then spent the 90s writing music for dozens of episodes of Star Trek shows. So, a disappointing round for Invasion USA. Next up, Purple Rain. Look, the thing about Purple Rain is that the soundtrack to this movie is maybe the best album ever recorded in the history of popular music. That doesn't give it more points, but I just want it on the record. There are 9 original songs by Prince and the Revolution that appear in the movie, and all 4 that were released as singles were top 10 hits, with 2 of them hitting #1. With this movie, it's easy to forget that there's also a musical score that's not by Prince. It's by Michel Colombier, who also scored 80s movies like Against All Odds and The Golden Child. The score is mostly kind of ambient, soft rock instrumentals, not very interesting, but yeah, fairly 80s. And sadly, we were robbed of what could have been the greatest 80s mashup of all time, Prince and Kenny Loggins. No points there. Let's talk about Rocky IV. The arc of the music in the Rocky franchise is fascinating. The first 2 movies obviously had all orchestral scores by Bill Conti, and the third movie did as well, but it also prominently featured the original song Eye of the Tiger by Survivor. Then for Rocky IV, Stallone was so impressed by the work that Vince DiNicola did writing songs for Staying Alive with Sly's brother Frank, that he brought him on to replace Conti as the composer for Rocky IV. And DiNicola went wild on those synthesizers, making a score that basically just sounds like The Final Countdown. And while Rocky III had 1 original song, Eye of the Tiger, Stallone used it again in this movie, but also added a whole album of original songs, including one by James Brown that reached the Billboard Top 10 and won a Grammy. And folks, I am so excited to announce that we finally have a goddamn Kenny Loggins song in this movie. 2 points right there. Next up is Scarface. This is another big Giorgio Moroder production, as he composed the score and wrote all 8 original songs on the soundtrack. This is pure synthwave stuff. The 80s sound that has aged really well and sounds extremely cool compared to like Rocky IV, which is just dorky as hell, but in an endearing way. Sadly, no top 10 singles here and no Kenny Loggins. Next is The Secret of My Success. The original score is by David Foster. best known as a music producer who worked extensively with the band Chicago. He only did a handful of film scores, including St. Elmo's Fire, and they were primarily in the 80s. This score is mostly soft rock keyboards and saxophone, so yeah, it's pretty 80s. Foster wrote and produced most of the original songs for the soundtrack, including the title track performed by Night Thrasher, which was nominated for a Golden Globe for Best Original Song, but lost to I've Had the Time of My Life from Dirty Dancing, a movie that is better than this one, but less 80s. Staying Alive does not actually have a regular musical score. There is no credited composer. Nearly every minute of the movie is filled with music, but it's all either non-diegetic needle drops or music from the Broadway show that the film is about. The original soundtrack, which featured 12 original songs, but in a devastating blow to Frank Stallone, only one top 10 hit, the song Far From Over. And as for the round about a song with the same name as the movie, I'm gonna give it a point here because this is a rare case of a sequel that is named after a song that was written for the original movie. And that song also appears again on the soundtrack for this one. Thrashin' is another movie with wall-to-wall music. The original score by Barry Goldwater is pretty 80s, swinging between John Carpenter-esque synths and wailing guitars. Only 2 of the songs featured in Thrashin' were recorded specifically for the movie, but one of them is a song actually called Thrashin' by Meatloaf, so it gets points there. Shockingly, no official soundtrack was ever actually released, which means no hit singles and, you guessed it, no Kenny Loggins. Finally, ending on a high note here, we have Top Gun, another one of the highest selling soundtracks of all time. We'll start with the score by Harold Faltermeyer. The main theme, you know, the drum machine and guitar solo that they used again in Maverick because it's so awesome, it actually sounds kind of timeless, but the rest of the score, all extremely 80s synths. And Faltermeyer, best known for his work on Beverly Hills Cop, is one of the premier composers of this era who basically just stopped working in film once the 90s rolled around. Beyond the score, there are the songs written and recorded for the movie itself, and as you probably know, these are a pretty big deal. Take My Breath Away by Berlin, the main love theme for Top Gun, plays an astounding 4 times during the movie. That song and Danger Zone, both written by Moroder, made it to #1 and #2 on the Billboard charts respectively. And as for the Kenny Loggins round, if I'm reading my notes correctly, Top Gun has 2 Kenny Loggins songs in one movie, Danger Zone and Playing with the Boys. 4 points right there, an absolutely incredible score. And so we have reached the end of round 3. Flashdance, thanks to one of the biggest soundtracks of all time, slid into first place here, but the real story, I think, is Top Gun coming from way behind, having the best round of any of these movies, and moving into 4th place. And Rocky IV just keeps doing better and rising up the charts, gaining extra points thanks to what to me was a huge surprise, the revelation that that James Brown song in the movie became a top 10 hit. We could have a real contender here, especially as we move into the politics round. And sadly, Invasion USA is just not delivering. The lack of a soundtrack for that and Thrashin', I think, has totally killed their chances. Tough luck, guys. All right, it's time to talk about politics in the 1980s. And I think I'm a little out of my depth here. I wasn't alive for most of that decade, so I think to get this part right, I'm gonna need to talk to some people who were actually there. Hold on a sec. Hello? Are you guys here?
Patrick, you're home, and you knocked.
You didn't barge in and announce yourself like some kind of French prince. Well, no. I mean, I didn't want to interrupt you guys. What if you were in the middle of something? Also, I'm so sorry that I haven't been back sooner. I wanted to get my feet solidly on the ground back in the city. But I'm actually here because I could use some help.
Of course. What is it?
Son, you can come to us for anything.
Okay, so I've been working on this video that's about movies from the 1980s.
Ah, so you want us to dress in neon and be extras?
I'll put the kettle on.
No, nothing like that. It's that, I've hit a bit of a wall with the video. See, I wasn't really around in the 80s. I was hoping I could talk to you guys and get some insight into what the culture and politics were like back then.
Wait, you want us to explain something to you?
I'll put the kettle on.
Son, I'm gonna need the chair. All right, now, let us talk about how one Ronald Reagan, leading man in Bedtime for Bonzo, destroyed the country within 8 years, and as a result became lionized by the conservative movement as the greatest president since Lincoln. Look, man, you could start with trickle-down economics, but that was like small change because he became enamored in the depths of his dementia with Star Wars, this make-believe defense system that could never work. And as Gorbachev...
And I'm back. Okay, politics. I'm ready. I got this. Let's go. So, 80s politics. There are about 800,000 books written on this, so obviously what I'm going to talk about here will not go into the depth of any of those. This is a movie channel, not a politics channel. Although, note to self, maybe add a politics corner to the show. Anyway, we are going to be making broad generalizations here, because we have to. This is just one segment of a larger video. This is really just going to be about how the politics and world events of that decade impacted American movies. When the 80s roll around, America is coming out of a messy, complicated decade. There was Watergate, Nixon resigning, the end of the Vietnam War, all that stuff. And then Ronald Reagan, this old cowboy movie star from the 1940s, shows up and says, hey, let's bring America back to a simpler time, the way things used to be. His message was a return to older values and a traditional way of life. Like he literally said,
to make America great again.
And so, as if reflecting the talking points of this new administration, the morally complex, artistically challenging new Hollywood of the 1970s gave way to simpler, more easily marketable movies, dominated by Don Simpson's high-concept approach and lots of good versus evil narratives. Partly due to the success of Spielberg and Lucas, although really I think the blame they get is overblown, mainstream American cinema shifted back toward the simplicity of the pre-1960 golden age of movies. While many of the biggest films of the 70s were aimed squarely at adults, like the Godfather movies, The Exorcist, or One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, in the 80s, studios tried to aim more of their major releases at broad audiences of all ages. Essentially, the audiences that made Star Wars, Jaws, or Rocky such huge hits. Now obviously you can't talk about 80s politics without talking about the Cold War. The Soviet Union was a major recurring feature in 80s American cinema, but the movies dealt with it in several different ways. There were quite a few movies that stayed on message with the Reagan administration, demonizing the Soviet Union and portraying them explicitly as the enemy. Like we're talking about Red Dawn, Invasion USA, obviously, or Rambo 3. But remember, Hollywood is generally more left-leaning than the Reagan administration, so a lot of movies took a less competitive, violent view of US-Soviet relations, portraying the rival nation sympathetically, or if not always the nation sympathetically, at least its citizens. These would be movies like Moscow on the Hudson, No Way Out, Red Heat, or Spies Like Us. During the 80s, wanting to reassert their military might after the embarrassment of Vietnam, the US got very involved in Central America and, to editorialize for a moment, kind of fucked up and destabilized the region. Since Central America was suddenly in the news a lot, We got a lot of movies about turmoil there, like Under Fire, El Norte, and Oliver Stone's Salvador. And then, less directly commenting on specific real-world events, but still connected, there were science fiction movies of the era, usually set in futuristic dystopian versions of America, that commented in different ways on Reagan's economic policies. These would be things like Escape from New York, RoboCop, Aliens, or The Running Man. And so if I'm reading this right, that is absolutely everything that happened politically during the 1980s that affected movies and that we have time to cover in one chapter of one video. Anyway, moving on to the Part 4 categories. Okay, first, for 2 points, does the movie directly deal with recent real-world events? Also for 2 points, does the Cold War play a role? For 1 to 5 points, how much does the movie demonize the Soviet Union? Also 1 to 5, how much does the movie reflect or comment on Reagan administration policies? And finally, for 1 to 5, does the movie showcase a return to simpler narratives and ways of life? First, we have Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo, and this round I think is going to be a preview of how the other teen and music-focused movies will probably score. This movie, as you can probably guess, has nothing to do with politics, or the Cold War, or Reagan, and it only earns points for its old-fashioned simple narrative about the good kids triumphing over the greedy businessmen, which really feels like a throwback to old MGM musicals. Sadly, it's pretty much the same story for Flashdance, which has been our top contender so far. The Cold War just doesn't come up very much in the world of dancing at bars. But I'm throwing it an extra point because having this centered around a steel mill, it does really seem like a throwback to old-fashioned American industry. Invasion USA is up next, and finally, this movie has a good round. This is a movie about, well, an invasion of the USA, led by a Soviet terrorist, so obviously it has some real-world political connections. Certain aspects of the movie, like the boat full of Cuban immigrants that's also smuggling drugs, feels like direct messaging from a conservative government. And it is absolutely a simple story about a lone American protecting his country. This is an extremely Reagan-era movie. Next is Purple Rain, and I am sorry, but this is not a strong round here. Unsurprisingly, this movie has basically nothing to do with politics. Minneapolis might as well be on its own planet, as Prince's personal struggles are way more important here than whatever conflicts are happening in the rest of the world. But its classic story of a brilliant musician striving for stardom does fit into the general return to simpler narratives, so it gets a few points there. Up next is Rocky IV, and as far as this round goes, I don't think anything is gonna top this. This is a Cold War movie with a script that might as well have been written by the Reagan administration and then handed to Stallone. The Soviet antagonists are cold and cruel, trained with machines, with none of the heart and warmth that the Americans have. It's a simple, inspiring story about American strength and courage. It is a spectacular piece of propaganda. Up next is Scarface. There isn't really any Cold War stuff in this movie, apart from this line.
I kill a communist for fun, but for a green card, I'm gonna carve him up real nice.
But it is very much rooted in, at the time, recent real-world events. Tony Montana arrives in Florida at the start of the movie as part of the Mariel boat lift, the mass immigration of Cuban refugees in 1980, and the story heavily involves the South American drug trade, a fixture of the news at the time. And the movie itself is a remake of the 1931 original, a clear return to the stories of old Hollywood. The Secret of My Success has no direct references to politics or world events, but it does tell an old-fashioned simple story about a small-town guy who comes to the city with big dreams to succeed in the world of finance. It's almost like a commercial for Reaganomics. Now, Staying Alive is not a political movie. No one mentions the Cold War, and I'm skeptical that Tony Manero even voted in the 1982 midterms. But where the original movie was a gritty, morally complicated movie that really encapsulated 70s cinema, this is a very simple, old-fashioned story, totally in line with Reagan's ideological return to the good old days, where people follow their dreams and succeed in the end. Up next is Thrashin', and as you probably guessed, this is another politics-light movie. All it really earns points for is the simple old-fashioned narrative. I'm just gonna say here, I don't think Thrashin' has a chance at winning this. And now, finishing the round off very strong is Top Gun. What's interesting about Top Gun is that it never directly mentions the Soviet Union or the Cold War. It doesn't really get involved in the politics of the time, but it's also clearly aware of them, and it's all about showing how awesome and powerful America and its military is compared to that vague, unspecified enemy. And for a movie that's not really subtle about anything, it is, I guess, slightly more subtle than Rocky IV, so it doesn't end up scoring quite as high, but still, a great showing here. And that does it for our penultimate round, and it turns out that politics, like Sarah Palin, was a real game changer. You can't be the most 80s movie ever made without some kind of reflection of Reagan-era politics or the Cold War, and so for most of the music-focused movies here, this is what sank them. Flashdance lost the commanding lead that it had held for 3 rounds. Invasion USA had its best round yet, but it's just not gonna be enough, because Rocky IV just tore things up and moved into a commanding lead, with Top Gun not far behind. We have 1 more round left, so you never know. Flashdance could have a late surge. Anything is possible, except Thrashin' winning. Sorry, Thrashin', you're done. And finally, we arrive at our last chapter, maybe the biggest one of all. We're talking about American culture in the 1980s. What trends were sweeping the nation? Where were people's heads at? What were everyone's priorities? Well, let's just dive in with one of the prevailing cultural themes of the decade.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
Now look, I'm not saying that in the 80s all Americans turned into selfish assholes, but greed, as a general vibe, did seem to hang over the culture. In the 80s, the most watched TV families went from working class to rolling in thick stacks of cheddar. There were shows like Dallas and Dynasty, but even the relatable sitcom families on shows like The Cosby Show and Family Ties were a lot better off financially than the sitcom families of the 70s. As a 1987 Washington Post article said, not since the 1920s, a decade that these Teflon years of the 1980s increasingly resemble, has the nation witnessed so much common celebration of greed and selfishness. Now, as then, the country has been encouraged to follow the example of big deal operators, get-rich-quick schemers, inside traders, market manipulators, laissez-faire entrepreneurs in political and corporate life. Private gain has been accorded a higher value than public service. Making it has been the era's slogan. The American dream had traditionally been to get a solid job, to make a living and provide for your family. But in the 80s, that became warped, now implying not just comfort, but wealth and luxury. In 1984, the great poet Madonna proclaimed that we are living in a material world. And folks, I think she was right. In the 80s, there was a notable jump in the number of luxury cars sold, get-rich and self-help books published, and Wall Street brokers who went to prison, which is honestly an 80s trend that I think we would all love to see make a comeback. Obviously linked in part to the Reagan administration's deregulation of the economy, there was a surge in the number of people getting MBAs, and a romanticized business culture centered around Wall Street emerged. The imagery of wearing suits, going to an office, and then theoretically getting rich became exciting and sexy. Lest we forget, this was the decade when The Art of the Deal was ghostwritten, published, and then never read by its credited author. There was a new emphasis on hyper-individualism. Michael Jordan became the cultural avatar for the singular exceptional talent, the greatest in his field. New corporate slogans emerged focusing on individual success. Nike had "Just Do It," and the Army had "Be All That You Can Be." The movies reflected that, with countless stories about spectacular talents, ambitious individuals striving to be the best in their field. Whether in business, or sports, or film, America in the 1980s was all about ambition. And it was also the decade that nostalgia was invented. Obviously not the concept itself, but nostalgia as a brand, a commercial strategy. In the 80s, an idealized nostalgia for a romanticized pre-1965 America was created as an advertising strategy aimed at baby boomers. Basically, a longing for the simpler America, after World War II, but before things got all complicated in the mid-60s.
That was before President Kennedy was shot, before the Beatles came, when I couldn't wait to join the Peace Corps. And I thought I'd never find a guy as great as my dad.
The 50s became a brand, which means that the way we talk about the 80s today as like a costume you put on when you go to an 80s themed party, that idea of a decade as a broad label was created in the 80s. Really makes you think, huh? Anyway, on to our final set of categories. First up, for 1 to 5 points, how much is the movie about greed? Then, also 1 to 5, is it about ambition and becoming the best? Then for 1 to 5, how great is the hyper-individualistic protagonist? 1 to 5, how nostalgic is it for pre-1965 America? For 1 to 5, how much of a focus on business is there? For 1 to 5, how big a role do wealth and materialism play? And then, bonus round, for 2 points, is there a shopping mall? Breakin' 2, Electric Boogaloo, is probably less about greed, ambition, and materialism than any other movie here. It's actually about community and fighting against greedy capitalists? Huh? What kind of an 80s movie is this? Like, the protagonists are all really skilled in their field, and there is a subplot about Kelly getting a major career opportunity, but she ends up passing on it to help her friends. So, not a great showing this round. Seriously, Breakin' kids, time to grow up and get more cutthroat with your breakdancing skills. Earn some money. Flashdance, on the other hand, is a dance movie that is all about personal ambition. Alex, played by Jennifer Beals, is just trying to get into dance school, not be the best in the world, so this doesn't quite reach the hyper-individualistic heights of, say, Rocky IV or Scarface. But even if she's not actively pursuing a dream of wealth, she does fall in love with Michael Nouri, her boss at the steel mill, and the movie does end with him waiting for her after her audition with his shiny new Porsche. So, points there. Invasion USA is about a lone hero who only has one friend who dies early on in the movie, and he lives in a shack out in the Florida Everglades. So what I'm saying is that he kind of avoids most of American culture. There is not much greed, ambition, or materialism here, but it is the only movie on this list that prominently features a shopping mall. There's a sequence that is like the Great American Fear in 1985. A shopping mall at Christmas gets attacked by evil communists led by a Soviet. So, definitely earned some points there. Purple Rain is another one of these classic stories about a brilliant artist who wants to be a star, so it earns points for the focus on ambition and the greatness of its protagonist. But what keeps it from hitting the top marks is that Prince, aka the Kid as he's known in the movie, only truly triumphs in the end by collaborating and accepting the artistic input of his bandmates.
It's a song the girls in the band wrote, Lisa and Wendy.
He can't do it all alone. And despite his extravagant outfits and custom motorcycle, wealth and money never actually factor into the plot. Rocky IV is not a movie about greed, but it is a movie in which Rocky is the greatest boxer in the world, and he's so rich that he can buy his brother-in-law, Paulie, a robot butler. This is no longer the gritty 70s Rocky walking the streets of Philadelphia. This is a rich man with endorsement deals. It's about the best of the best facing off, deciding who is the greatest in the world. So what I'm saying is, this is a big round for Rocky. Definitely better than his first round against Drago, am I right? Okay, it's Scarface time. This one underperformed in some of the early rounds, but this is the one where it really thrives. This movie is, above all else, a study of greed, ambition, wealth, and materialism. I mean, can you even imagine the street value of Tony's desk at the end of that movie? And even if it's not traditionally about the corporate world, it is about succeeding in business. Look, these guys wear a lot of suits, and they have meetings, and they deposit money in the bank. This round, Scarface is the one to beat. It looks like The Secret of My Success is the only movie giving Scarface some real competition this round. While that movie is an indulgent but ultimately cautionary tale about greed, this is a movie about how fun financial ambition in the corporate world can be, and how ultimately it can end with a cool yuppie taking over the company. I'm sure a lot of people were thinking that I should have included Oliver Stone's Wall Street on this list, but The Secret of My Success beat it out because here, the good guys are rewarded for their ambition and they never get arrested. Now, Staying Alive. Here we have yet another movie about artistic ambition, and compared to the heroes of Flashdance or Purple Rain, Tony Manero goes pretty far. He becomes the star of a Broadway show. But while he's portrayed as very talented, he's not a dancing genius, and he's not ruthlessly ambitious. One of his love interests is rich, but in the end, he turns her down. This movie is more about personal fulfillment. I mean, it literally ends with the hero walking off and celebrating by himself. So a solid round, but nothing close to Scarface. Thrashin' performs similarly. It's about a talented protagonist who wants to achieve a big goal, and then does. It's about ambition and individual talent and the career prospect of signing a deal with a major skateboarding company, but it still does not quite compare to other contenders. And now, our final contestant in our final round, it's time for Top Gun. This is a movie that is almost entirely set away from 80s American culture, taking place all on aircraft carriers and military bases instead of offices and shopping malls. But what really matters here is that more than almost any other movie this decade, it is about ambition, about a hyper-individualistic protagonist who thinks he's the best and is doubted by everyone he encounters, and in the end confirms that yes, he is the best. A strong showing for Top Gun, but it may not be quite enough to claim the title. And so, here we are. As we tally our final scores, let's think back on everything we've learned about this decade. It was a strange time for America, full of arguably unearned confidence and shifts in politics and culture that can be traced back as the root of many of our current problems. And the same goes for cinema. Not to act like 70s Hollywood was some kind of utopia for filmmakers, but there was a clear shift in the 80s toward treating movies like commercial products instead of art. And on average, movies got dumber. We talk fondly about 80s movies as this collection of wacky, fun movies full of original SNL cast members, bathed in neon lighting, and that very particular film grain that immediately gives away films from this decade. And despite the bad systemic shifts that happened within the industry, there are a ton of wonderful movies. And having researched literally every movie that came out that decade, there was also a whole lot of shit that has rightly been forgotten. Like, when was the last time you heard someone talk about the 1985 animated sci-fi adventure movie Star Chaser, The Legend of Orin, or Gotcha, the teen sex comedy / spy movie starring Anthony Edwards and Linda Fiorentino, or the Indiana Jones knockoff Jake Speed? Jeez, I can't believe how much of my brain now is just full of dumb movies that I learned about working on this video. But all that said, there are also obviously plenty of genuine masterpieces made in the 80s. Scorsese, Spielberg, and John Carpenter did some of their best work. Spike Lee, the Coen brothers, Sam Raimi, and James Cameron started off their careers. John Hughes revolutionized teen movies, and Die Hard changed the action genre forever. And most importantly, it was the decade that gave us RoboCop. The 80s, like every decade, were complicated. But enough about that. You've been waiting like an hour for me to answer one simple question. What is the most 80s movie ever made? It's Rocky IV. Now look, obviously, by our foolproof scientific numerical scoring system, it wins by a huge margin, 8 points ahead of Top Gun, the second place finisher. But there's more to it than just numbers. You see, Rocky, the original Rocky, is a quintessential 70s movie. It didn't cost very much, it was written by a little-known actor who also played the title character. It's an endearing street-level story about a nice guy who doesn't even win in the end, but he proves something to himself and defies everyone's expectations. It's gritty, it's naturalistic, it's shot on the streets of Philadelphia. And then they made a sequel, and another one, and another one. And as they went on, they morphed from 70s movies into 80s movies. Rocky IV is a cartoon. The first movie is about a down-on-his-luck working-class guy just trying to earn some respect by boxing. Rocky IV is about the richest, most famous athlete in the world winning the Cold War by fighting an evil Russian trained by machines. In the first movie, there is one montage. By Rocky IV, it feels like half the movie is just montages. But Rocky IV isn't just the most 80s movie because of its number of montages, or number of songs on the soundtrack, or the Cold War themes, or the extravagant wealth of its protagonists. It's because it shows how the 80s transformed what Rocky was. I think if you want to truly understand 80s America, all you have to do is watch Rocky, and then watch Rocky IV, and see what changed. Now look, I know this video is going to get like 5,000 comments complaining about movies I left out and should have talked about, and arguing with my conclusions. And that's cool. Argue all you want, engagement is good for the algorithm. But look, narrowing down this list from literally over 1,000 movies was not easy. It took a really long time. And actually, in the extended cut of this video, I talk more about my list of honorable mentions, the ones that just barely missed the cut, including Commando and Over the Top, and you can watch that exclusively on Nebula. I think you know all this by now, but I'm gonna say it again because I think it's important. Nebula is the curated streaming platform that I had a hand in developing, where you can watch all the videos by me, plus about 150 of the best creators on the internet, with no ads and in better streaming video quality than YouTube. And this season, I've been releasing extended cuts of every episode that you can only watch on Nebula. Nebula also has a ton of great original projects, like it's where Lindsay Ellis just released her first video in over a year, and it's the only place where you can watch the feature film I made, Night of the Coconut. Plus, here is a big important announcement that I'm saying for the first time right here. Finally available right now, only on Nebula, are the Night of the Coconut bonus features. There are 3 commentary tracks featuring me, obviously, and the cast, and the writers, and the composer, and the executive producer, plus the extended version of the big Zoom call crossover scene with way more cameos that got cut out of the final film. Also, hey, here's fun news. As of me writing this, Nebula just hit 600,000 paying subscribers. I think that's cool. Don't you want to be one of them? And we recently folded Nebula classes into regular Nebula, so you can also watch my 80-minute class on how to make a movie. There are so many reasons to sign up. And the best way is with our bundle with CuriosityStream, the great streaming service dedicated to nonfiction programming with thousands of documentaries, including a bunch of documentaries about the 80s, from 80s history to American culture to business, all that stuff. All you have to do is sign up at curiositystream.com/Patrick H. Willems, and you can get an annual subscription for only $14.79. And that also gets you an annual subscription to Nebula for free. That is 2 streaming services for a full year for less than $15. I'm not gonna lie, it's a very good deal. So come on, winter is coming, it's getting cold, you're gonna need stuff to watch while you're staying inside to keep warm. Nebula, CuriosityStream, the extended cut of this video. What are you waiting for? And that's it. We did it. We covered an entire decade in one video, and we found the most 80s movie of them all. I think it's time to celebrate.
Patrick, are you finished?
Sorry, got a little carried away there. Whew, that was such a rush. I learned so much.
Yeah, but like, how is that useful? In real life, building a successful career is more than doing a bunch of training montages and dating the owner of a steel mill.
So you were paying attention.
I'll admit, seeing the simple pleasure you get from pursuing this obsession, no matter how stupid or irrelevant it is to the broader culture, it is kind of encouraging.
And I think maybe that's what we can learn from that weird, cynical time that forever damaged the American film industry. Like the heroes of those movies, they didn't succeed by being like everyone else. Tom Cruise in Risky Business didn't get into Princeton by being a member of the Future Enterprisers Club. He got in by turning his parents' house into a brothel. That's outside the box thinking.
Yeah, and Jennifer Beals in Flashdance, she wasn't classically trained. She developed her own unique style, and that's how she nailed her audition.
And I think that's what these videos need to be. Whatever weird shit I'm interested in that no one else is talking about, presented in a way that no one else is doing.
Yes! And I'll make a SoundCloud or something. Get back to me on that. The point is, we take our passion
and make it happen. Seems like you were inspired by these movies as well, Alt Chloe. I mean, regular Chloe? New regular Chloe?
Just Chloe is fine.
Hey, speaking of being ourselves, what do you think other Patrick is up to?
Patrick Explains Patrick? Oh, that guy was such an interdimensional headache. Who even cares what that amoral goofus is doing?
Hello and welcome to the end of this extremely long video. I am here right now with a very important announcement. See, I know a lot of you watching this are active Letterboxd users, and recently, the folks at Letterboxd reached out to me to let me know that Night of the Coconut, our feature-length film that was released earlier this year, will qualify for being featured in their 2022 Year in Review lists if it reaches 2,000 ratings submitted by users by the end of the year. That's not reviews, not written reviews, literally just star ratings, like 1 to 5 that people click on. And so, I am here to ask you to help us get there. We're pretty far along, but we just need, that extra stretch. And so all you have to do is go over to letterboxd.com or open the Letterboxd app. It's free to make an account if you don't already have one. It just takes a second. And just give it a rating. I don't care if it's 5 stars. I don't care if it's 1 star. I don't care if you've actually seen the movie or not. This is it. That's all I'm asking you to do. And as an incentive, we're doing a giveaway. So if you take a screenshot of your rating to prove you did it, and send it to us on Twitter, Instagram, Discord, email, whatever. Just use the hashtag NOTC to 2000 so we can find it. And then at the end, when we get there, we will pick a random person to receive this. The actual robot Charles prop used in the flashback Charles origin sequence in the movie. It's pretty cool. You can own a piece of film history. And anyway, that's it. Please help us get to 2,000 ratings. It doesn't really mean anything, but I don't know. I think it's fun. It would make me happy. So that's all. Thank you for watching. Hope you're having a great holiday season. And check out this cool piece of fan art that was sent in recently. It's a Charles action figure. That's all.